Having recently watched both of the Top Gun films for the first time, I was feeling very inspired and wanted to try and make something similar with visual effects. This video is going to be breaking down how I made this scene. I'm going to cover all of the stages, right from the modelling and texturing of the assets, right up to the final colour grade, and of course everything in between. I really liked the aesthetic of all the sunset shots of them on the helicarriers in both films, so I knew pretty much straight away that's what I was going to try and replicate for this video. The helicarrier and fighter jet models were downloaded from Sketchfab. If I tried to model those myself, I'd still be modelling right now instead of recording this voiceover, but I tried my best to make all the other assets from scratch. As always, if you're interested in picking them up, the project files from this video are on my Patreon, so you can get hold of all the 3D assets that are rigged and textured. There's the Blender scenes with all the animation and simulations, and there's also the nuke scripts with all the compositing. So, how exactly do we get from this to the finished product? Like a lot of my projects, I start off by gathering some reference images. This is usually just for modelling and texturing reference for some of the stuff I'm going to be making. And also for this project, I grabbed some screenshots from the film itself, as I was trying to pretty much replicate some of the shots one for one. So they were quite useful to look at for things like the framing and the colour grade as well. My approach to 3D modelling is to try and get away with as much as I can. Like I said at the beginning, if I got too stuck into the details, I'd never finish the videos. So a lot of the time now I try and model something to get it just to where it needs to be, and then I take it the rest of the way with textures and then compositing in the end, and try and hide my sins as much as I can. I've learned from experience of doing this kind of thing for a few years now that one of the only things you really can't hide behind later on in the process is low resolution topology. So I make sure that everything I'm modelling, even if it's simple shapes, has plenty of loop cuts, and if necessary some subdivision surface modifiers, and then I'll also go in and add things like a bevel modifier so that all of the edges aren't perfect 90-degree angles. I started out by blocking out the basic shapes, so things like the door and the floor and the walls, and then I slowly went in and built up the scene, adding more detail to the models and then adding more objects as well. I specifically planned to make a lot of these shots quite backlit, so there would be lots of contrast in the shots. This was intentional so that I didn't have to go too overboard with making the textures really high resolution, or going nuts with the modelling either. The high levels of contrast mean there's lots of shadow in the shot and you don't see all of the details. So as long as there's some sort of suggestion of silhouettes of things in the shadows, they don't need to be really high quality assets. And also, even though both the assets that I downloaded were pretty good, they don't hold up really close to camera. So the lighting was a big way that I got around that issue. And then for example, for populating the stuff in the shadows that would barely be visible, I just brought in some assets that I'd made from a previous video a couple of years ago. It was basically a load of generic factory assets, things like oil drums and panels on the walls. So I just dropped a few of those assets in here and there just to add a little bit more complexity, but they're not particularly photorealistic. A lot of them are just projected textures on some low poly geo, so they couldn't be hero assets, they're just kind of in the corners. Another thing that's really difficult to fake is the next level of texture detail on top of just adding generic PBR materials. If that's all you rely on, then the scenes often look like the textures are slightly tiled, or they're just really clean because there's no additional detail on top of those layers. So I tried something out for this video that I've never really done before, which was I exported the UVs from Blender into Affinity Photo and then hand painted a load of textures. You could do this in Blender as well with the stencil painting, but I just found it a lot easier to work with. You could do the same kind of thing in Photoshop as well. So for example, to make the lines on the floor, I put down the block colours of where they needed to be, and then I used a load of the texture brushes like the dry media brushes, and created a mask layer that was just black and white, and I just essentially painted in loads of detail into the textures. This does an amazing job of making it look really scuffed up, and like the paint has had loads of things moving over it over the years and lots of weathering effects. I also did some stuff like adding in some tyre tracks going over them, and it was really effective. It's actually one of the most successful things I think that came out of this video, and I'll be using this workflow a lot more in the future. I also used those brushes to paint some additional grunge textures, so as well as just the tiled PBR materials that I was using, I could actually go in and specifically add some hand-painted stuff to break it up and make it look a bit more organic. I did this in a couple of places on both of the floor materials, and I also did it on some of the walls. So I found some rust leak textures and I painted those in on a lot of the corners of the metal where the water would run down the walls. And again, it just adds an extra level of detail that's not just procedural. And it makes the scene a lot more tangible because you're actually putting that wear and tear in the areas it would actually occur instead of just applying it generically across the whole mesh. I didn't do too much rigging for this video. It wasn't really worth it because there's only a couple of shots where the plane's moving, but I did want some basic suspension controls for the underneath of the plane in that shot where it takes off. So I just added 2 bones. I had the main body parented to one, and then the landing gears were parented to the bone underneath. And that way I could just animate the body to move up and down as the plane's taking off and going over some bumps. There's actually very few keyframes on any of the animation. I relied quite heavily on noise modifiers for this project. So for example, there's a noise modifier on the rotation of the front wheel to make it seem like it's darting around a bit as it's going over the uneven terrain of the runway. And there's also noise modifiers on the rotation of all of the panels and flaps on the side of the plane that open. And as the plane's taking off, they're animated to fade in over the course of about 30 frames, which makes it feel like the intensity of the engine rumble is increasing. And it gives all of those little details on the plane some micro movement and animation, which makes it feel a lot more alive. Speaking of micro movement and detail, once all the animation and everything was blocked out, I went in and did a simulation pass on some of the assets that I thought would benefit from it. So a few of the shots have assets that have cloth simulations on them. Things like the bits of fabric on the end of the wings in the first shot, the hose pipe that's hanging up on the wall, and I also did one on the wires on the POV shot of the plane taking off. Because they're just hanging down, it all felt a little bit static, and I just thought that because of the wind and the speed of the plane, they would move a bit in real life. So I just added the vertices on the end of the wires to a vertex group, and then used that to keep them in place, and did a cloth sim on the rest of the wires so they would wobble slightly. And I added some slight wind to make them move a bit organically, as well as reacting to the animation of the plane. The other simulations are a bit more obvious. Those are the 2 smoke sims that I did. I used the renders of the smoke to drive some heat distortion in Nuke, so I'm actually not really using the renders of the smoke to overlay as smoke itself. I'm just using the alpha channel of the result to use to drive a displacement map and plug into the heat haze so that dictates where the heat haze appears. And then one of the last steps I do in Blender once all the shots are in a pretty good place is I'll render a version 1 of all of the shots and then just do a slap comp of it in Nuke. They were very basic. I essentially just put a placeholder sky in the background and then comped the CG over the top with a bit of a glow. And then from there I could look at the shots fully assembled and work out what I needed to do to push them a little bit further. A lot of the times this was just going in and adding some additional assets. I did things like adding some chains onto the planes so that they would be held in place on the platform. I did a few bits like adding some cables onto the floor, just little details that brought the scene to life a bit more. The compositing of this video was actually pretty straightforward. All of the shots basically involved a similar workflow of getting a sky and putting it in the background, and then just placing the renders of the environment and the planes on top. And then from there it's really just a case of balancing the colour of the sky with the environment, adding things like light wrap, lens distortion, chromatic aberration, all the little things that make the shot come to life. Instead of using the actual light wrap node in Nuke for this, I started doing it manually because I prefer the look of it. You could kind of consider this like an exponential light wrap, I suppose. It's a much softer kind of bloomy version of light wrap, and I just think it looks a bit more photorealistic. It's very simple, so I just took the alpha of all the 3D renders and then merged that over the background and set the merge to stencil, which cuts it out. Then from there you can add multiple increments of blur, so I start off very low and then I slowly turn the size of the blur up and turn the mix down as I go, which once you add about 3 or 4 of these nodes gives you a really nice soft fall off for the light wrap. And then I just merge it very subtly over the top of the CG and pre-mult it so it doesn't go over the edges. I rendered 10% overscan on all of these shots so I could add some lens distortion to make them feel less 3D. And then as well as the lens distortion, I'm adding other lensy artifacts like chromatic aberration at the bottom of the script and a bit of vignetting. Once the comps were done, I rendered them out of Nuke, and finally I moved into Resolve to do the final color grade. I've got a lot more into grading very recently, especially after spending some time sitting with the colorists at work and watching how they approach a shot. And it always blows me away how much a really good grade can improve a project. So I started trying to implement that into my YouTube videos a bit more. For this video in particular, I wanted to emulate that look of the film that the first Top Gun was shot on, with that really nice warm sunset temperature. For all of the shots I go through and follow the same process. There's a bit of balancing the exposure and contrast across all the shots in the sequence, adding a bit of saturation and tweaking some of the colours here and there. I set a little bit of a look, so for a lot of the shots I put quite a lot of warmth into the highlights to give it that sunsetty feel. And then I selectively went in and did some power windows, which is like adding vignettes and gradients onto the side of the frames to shape the image a little bit more. And then finally I'm adding a film grain emulation at the end, which is applying a film stock look and some film grain and a few other artifacts that come with shooting on analog film. This looks really nice over the top of everything, and especially adding grain I always find just beds everything together a little bit more. Hopefully that look into my process was enjoyable. Again, the project files are available on my Patreon if you'd like to pick them up. Consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.